The relentless afternoon sun left the air heavy with humidity and the street pavement hot as an oven. But all POWs were required to march, even the sick ones. It was a rule enforced by the bayonet ends of guards' guns. Thus, 27-year-old malaria-ridden Ensign Harry Whitman, a stout young man with light brown hair, shadowed eyes, and a square, serious face, stumbled his way through Manila on May 24, 1942. He was a prisoner of the Japanese, and, with some 5,000 other American POWs, was on parade through the Philippines' main city so that the Filipino populace would understand the Japanese victors' might. Being exposed to the blazing sun for some 4 miles worsened Whitman's malaria symptoms. His marching companion, Al-Masam, took over the burden of the burlap sack that held all of the ensign's worldly belongings, and that helped, a little, for a mile or so. But Whitman's fever worsened. He became delirious. Despite his fears of Japanese punishment, Salm pulled Whitman from the marching column. Laying the sick man on the hot ground, Salm covered him with an old raincoat and gave him some quinine. Whitman shivered violently. Both men were saturated in perspiration from their now 5-mile march in 90-plus degrees heat. Then, just as Salm had predicted, Japanese guards were by their sides in mere moments, their bayonets flashing in the unforgiving sun. This is Left Behind. Welcome to Left Behind, a podcast about the people left behind when the U.S. surrendered the Philippines in the early days of World War II. I'm your host and researcher, Anastasia Harmon. My great-grandfather, Al-Masam, was a prisoner of war in the Philippines, and his memoir inspired me to tell the stories of his fellow captives. It's finally May, and all month long, in commemoration of Memorial Day, I'll be publishing episodes regarding American heroes, all of them single and under age 30, who gave their lives in service of their country. These men weren't married, they didn't have children, and as the years pass, are at greater risk of being forgotten. So, during this month, I'm asking a favor. If an episode or story resonates with you, please share it with a friend, so that together we can work to keep the memories of these men alive for generations to come. Today I'm sharing the story of one of the original men who inspired this podcast, Harry Whitman. So yes, my great-grandfather and his memoir are the overall inspiration. But Harry Whitman was one of the first 3 POWs my great-grandfather mentioned who I wanted to learn more about. Frank Pyzik from episode 1 is the second man, and I will tell the story of the third man in a future episode. Harry Whitman and Salm were marching companions on their way to Cabanatuan, which we'll learn more about in this episode. In his memoir, Salm mentioned not knowing what happened to his friend Whitman after the war. When I first read that, and we're talking a good 20 years ago now, I wanted to know what happened to Whitman as well. So I began researching his life, and I found the answer. I have been wanting to tell his story since I started this podcast. And today, I am proud to finally share with you the story of Harry Gill Whitman. Let's jump in. Harry Gill Whitman Jr.'s story begins 26 and a half years before that dreadful march through Manila, in much an opposite place and time, Connecticut, on October 20th, 1915. He was the oldest of 5 children, born to Harry Sr. and Emily Whitman. Within a few years, the Whitman family relocated to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where Harry Jr. grew up and Harry Sr. was a vice president for an asphalt company. The family did well financially, even having a live-in servant in those pre-Depression years. And the Whitmans were a well-known family in Grand Rapids. In his teen years, Harry joined the Central High School yearbook staff, as well as the Phi Chem Club. I think that's short for Physics Chemistry Club. In fact, young Harry was the, quote, pride and joy, close quote, of that club's advisor, Mr. Barber. Harry graduated high school in June 1934. He attended junior college in Grand Rapids before transferring to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in Boston. He was commissioned an ensign in the U.S. Naval Reserves shortly before graduating from MIT in June 1941, where he earned a bachelor's in engineering with an emphasis in naval architecture and marine engineering. 2 months after MIT graduation, so in August 1941, Ensign Whitman began active duty. And on October 24, 1941, just 4 days after his 26th birthday, he left Honolulu, Hawaii, on a ship bound for Manila. Arriving in the Philippines, Ensign Whitman was assigned to the Cavite Navy Yard, which is about 10 miles southwest of Manila as the crow flies, 25 miles if you drive. Before World War II, Cavite Navy Yard was the only United States ship repair facility in the Pacific. I don't know precisely what Whitman's assignment was while stationed at Cavite for the month before the war began, but as an officer with a degree in naval architecture and marine engineering, I'm assuming he was somehow involved with the repair of ships. Cavite Navy Yard was bombed and, for all intents and purposes, destroyed on December 10, 1941. That's just 2 days after the Japanese first attacked the Philippines. From what I found, the Navy personnel were transferred to Mariveles, which is on the very southern end of Bataan, and at some point Whitman was transferred to Corregidor Island. Now, this is pure conjecture on my part, but Whitman seems like a prime candidate to have joined the Naval Battalion on Bataan. The Naval Battalion was a pulled-together group of sailors, air corpsmen, and a few trained Marines, armed with scrounged-together weapons, and who were tasked with holding a small Japanese invasion force from reaching Mariveles. After proving themselves on Bataan, the Naval Battalion men were sent to Corregidor to help the 4th Marines defend the beaches there. So I think it's possible that Whitman could have been part of the Naval Battalion and Corregidor beach defenses. Although he was an officer, so perhaps he wasn't part of that. There are no records, well, any that I've come across, that list the men of the Naval Battalion, so I can only speculate. By the way, for more details on the Naval Battalion and their actions, see episode 13. It's among my favorite Bataan stories. Well, regardless of how he got to Corregidor, Whitman was there when the island fell, and he became a prisoner of war. He spent almost a month at the 92nd Garage on Corregidor, which I described in detail in episode 50. Then, in late May 1942, the Japanese loaded all the American Corregidor POWs onto a transport ship for a ride to Manila. The Japanese transport ship moored about 5 miles south of Manila and 2 miles offshore. The POWs boarded landing barges to take them closer to shore. Almasam wrote,
"When we were about 200 to 300 feet away from the beach, we were ordered to jump into the bay. The gunwales of the boats were up to our breasts, so we had to disembark out over the lower ramp on the stern. There was only room for about 4 or 5 to leap off at one time, and as the barge began to drift seaward, caused with the motion of disembarking men, the last occupants, and I was one of them, who jumped overboard, were in water nearly 6 feet deep. That just about left the top of my head out of the water. The bay bottom here was muddy and sandy."
Once they emerged from the water, the POWs were placed into columns.
"We were a weary, hungry lot of humanity, unshaven, unkempt, and dirty. It was now about high noon, and we almost wilted in the torrid heat, an ideal condition to cause those previously infected to have the dreaded and recurrent malaria, which happened in numerous cases during the never-to-be-forgotten march. In our sand-filled, soggy shoes, we began our long, hot trek up the famous Dewey Boulevard, through the streets of the city of Manila, to the old Spanish Bilibid prison.
The POWs had left the 92nd Garage the morning before, so about 30 hours earlier, and they had been given no water and no food since then. The men were weak and tired. Now, as you may have heard me say before, exact numbers of the captured Americans in the Philippines are hard to know. Approximate numbers suggest there were about 5,000 American POWs and 10,000 Filipino POWs on Corregidor. Official records weren't necessarily being kept during the last battle on Corregidor, so it's not known precisely how many Americans died there. Not to mention there probably isn't an exact count of how many men on Corregidor to begin with, because many men left Bataan for the island right before Bataan fell. All this to say that the Japanese paraded a rather long column of American POWs through the streets of downtown Manila. Japanese guards on horseback flanked the columns. Filipinos, forced by Japanese soldiers, lined the streets as the defeated Americans went by. It was a show of power to the Filipino populace. Japan was mightier than the United States.
But the Japs misunderstood the Filipino character and his loyalty, for the most part, to the American regime. Japanese control during these 5 months had not convinced the Filipinos. The liberty he enjoyed under America was now strangely missing. He realized he had lost that, and it soured the Filipino. As the motley throng of captive American troops were prodded along, many fell, but the Jap guards ruthlessly prodded them to their feet with their bayonets and sabers. If Japan thought the moral effect of the Filipinos upon seeing us so degraded would be regarded in the manner they had anticipated, they were very much mistaken. The understanding and kindly Filipinos did not smile or jeer nor scorn us, but rather they had the look in their eyes and on their countenances of sorrow and sympathy for us. Many of them openly wept. Others made the V sign with their fingers when the guards were not alert. We marched by doing a pretty good job of holding up our heads, and with pride, I noted it was going to take more than a Jap bayonet to wipe that courageous grin off the American face. In view of our temporary defeat, this was about all we could offer in return for the gallantry of those loyal Filipinos. We remembered then, and so did the Filipinos now looking upon us, that for every white soldier on the Bataan Death March, just 7 weeks before, there were about 9 Filipino soldiers by his side, and together they all endured the brutal punishment and the lash and venom of the Jap conqueror, and in hundreds of cases endured until death mercifully rescued them.
I found a couple pictures of this march, and I've put them on the website. You'll find the links in the episode description. In the passage that's coming up, Psalm mentions a malaria attack. So here are some symptoms of malaria to give you a better idea of what Psalm was witnessing. High fever, shaking chills that can range from moderate to severe, profuse sweating, headache, abdominal pain, muscle pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, deep breathing and respiratory distress, impaired consciousness, and convulsions. So, not conditions in which one is physically up from marching in the sun.
When the column I was marching in neared the heart of the city, Ensign Harry Whitman, who had been with me on Corregidor, and who was my marching buddy, had recurrent malaria induced by exposure to the blazing sun. He began to stumble along, and the only help I could give was the small relief of carrying his burlap sack containing his worldly belongings. This eased things for him a little. The added burden of carrying his baggage began telling on me, but after another mile he steadily became worse, and his fever was so high he was almost delirious. What to do? I wasn't too sure what the unpredictable Jap guard might do. I wasn't so valiant I could withstand the jab of a sharp bayonet with calm. Another look at Whitman's face, however, and I dragged him out of the column beside the road and quickly covered him with an old raincoat we had salvaged on the rock. I fed him 10 or 15 grains of quinine, which I had on me. Soon he was shivering violently with the chills that alternate with the fever of malaria-ridden victim. We both were drenched with perspiration, and I had reached a stage myself where I couldn't travel much further without a respite after the 5 miles that lay behind us. Almost immediately, a couple of Japanese guards and a Jap policeman were upon us. I expected and was prepared for the usual violent physical treatment. However, even the Japanese know the sickening and debilitation effects of malaria through their own experience with it. They felt my friend's hot, feverish brow as he lay with closed eyes and colorless face, and wonders of wonders, they actually left us alone. I felt a little relieved for both our sakes. He lay there, and by opened his eyes. I spied a Filipino pushing an ice cream wagon. Although I knew the Jap did not permit speech or contact with Filipino civilians, I managed to purchase several paper envelopes of mango sherbet. I couldn't be sure how sanitary the ice was, but it was cold. I fed some to my shipmate, who began to recover. The cold sherbet, together with the quinine and the rest of an hour, helped him. Later, a Jap truck came along and picked us up along with other casualties who had fallen out previously and took us to the entrance of the Bilibid prison.
Bilibid Prison was a prison in Manila. It became a POW camp, hospital, and transfer station. Throughout the war, POWs being transferred to Japan would stay here for a time before boarding their ships. And on the afternoon of May 24, 1942, when Salmon Whitman arrived, it was filled with American prisoners of war sleeping on dirty concrete floors. So, Salmon Whitman fashioned themselves a shelter along one of the prison walls, using a couple of canvas shelter halves. And, luckily for them, they found a small patch of grass and had a couple blankets, which helped make them more comfortable during the rainstorm that night. They were also able to shower and wash their filthy clothing and get some food. Just rice, but better than not eating. Whitman and Salm remained in the prison the next day. At 3 o'clock in the morning, on May 26th, they were awoken and marched with about 1,500 other prisoners to the Manila train station. Salm wrote,
"We were ordered into a train of boxcars waiting for us. These boxcars were much smaller than the standard size used in the United States, but nevertheless, they literally stuffed 100 men and officers in each car until, figuratively speaking, a shoehorn had to be used to squeeze the last man. No cattle car was ever so crowded. Obviously, there were no facilities or conveniences therein. We sat down or stood up the best we could in our filthy, cramped quarters. There was very little ventilation, except that which came in through the small slide doors in the middle on either side of the car, at which point 2 Jap armed guards took their positions. The train pulled out about 6:30 a.m. and rattled northward across the broiling Luzon plains, with its destination the town of Cabanatuan, about 75 miles away in the rice paddy country. The conditions under which we traveled these 8 hours in the cars is a story itself. The hot, still tropical air and the searing sun burned down on the thin metal roofs of those cars, plus partial ventilation almost stifled those who could not get near the side door openings.
Many of the men were sick with dysentery and defecated where they stood. The lack of oxygen made the men drowsy. A lethargic Salm was suddenly startled awake by loud voices. An army corporal was shouting at an army captain. The captain attempted to discipline the corporal, which angered the corporal even more. "You can get away with giving us orders in the army, but not now, brother. You're a prisoner of war just like the rest of us. You don't have a damn bit more authority than we do. If you think you do, try doing something we aren't permitted to do, and see if you can get away." "Yeah, try it!" And then he began punching the captain. Finally, they arrived at the city of Cabanatuan train station. Cabanatuan City is about 70 miles directly north of Manila, in central Luzon Island. The POWs stumbled off the train, marched about half a mile, and were deposited in an area enclosed by barbed wire. Surprisingly, Salm got permission from a guard to buy a pail full of mangoes and bananas from a Filipino woman. Instantly, he was surrounded by men asking to buy the fruit. They slept under their makeshift shelters that night. Early the next morning, they were given a baseball-sized rice ball and then placed into columns of 100 men each and marched out of the encampment area. I want to stop for a moment to address something. It's a common misconception that men captured on Corregidor were part of the Bataan Death March. That is not true. Only the men surrendered on Bataan were part of that atrocity. The Corregidor men were taken by ship to Manila, marched through Manila, trained 70 miles to Cabanatuan City, and then marched to the Cabanatuan POW camps. No part of their route crossed paths with the Bataan Death March route. I've put a map on the Left Behind website that shows the 2 routes so that you can see the difference. When Whitman arrived, there were 3 POW camps near Cabanatuan City, which is why you'll often hear me say Cabanatuan POW camps, plural. As best I've been able to make out, Camp Number 1 was about 5.5 miles east of Cabanatuan City. Camp Number 2, about 9.5 miles east of the city. and camp number 3 was 14 miles east of the city. I've created a map of where I think each of the camps was located, and you can find it on the website as well. The American POWs captured on Corregidor, including Whitman and Salm, were initially marched past camps 1 and 2 to camp 3, which is the farthest from Cabanatuan City. Once that camp was filled, the remaining Corregidor POWs were placed in camp number 2. But camp number 2 lacked a water supply, so it closed permanently, and those POWs were transferred to camp number 1 in early June 1942. One of those camp 2 transferred to camp 1 men, I believe, was Walter Werner, whose story I told in episode 41. Now let's talk about the Baton men. They had been at Camp O'Donnell since mid to late April. Episode 32 gives details of that horrific place. Those who survived Camp O'Donnell were transferred to the Cabanatuan POW camps around the same time that the Corregidor men were. But who arrived first? I don't know, because I've heard accounts both ways. Perhaps they were arriving at the same time. One account I've read says that the Baton Death March survivors arrived at Camp 3 before the Corregidor POWs, and that also arriving at Camp 3 before the Corregidor men were the Americans who were patients in Baton field hospitals when the peninsula was surrendered. All this is to say that there were 15,000 to 18,000 American POWs in the Cabanatuan POW camps by early June 1942. Salm, Whitman, and the other POWs began their 14-mile march to Cabanatuan Camp Number 3 in the pre-dawn hours of May 27, 1942. The sun soon rose, bringing stifling heat. The men's packs felt heavier and heavier. Some men collapsed, but were prodded at bayonet point back into their marching columns. After about 5 miles, the columns halted for a change of guard. Looking around for water, all that the POWs could find was a ditch of stagnant water that the Carabao water buffalo wallowed in. With no other choice, men scooped it up, treated it with iodine, if they had some, and drank. It tasted like poison, but gave their dehydrated bodies some moisture to survive on. As they set to marching again, the men could see a large compound with dozens of thatched roof nipa huts. They got excited. Their journey was almost ended. They could finally rest. As they walked past this compound, which turned out to be Camp Number 1, they became utterly disheartened. My great-grandfather wrote,
Marching in the direct rays of the sun, which hung like a hot molten ball in the cloudless sky, Ensign Whitman beside me had another attack of malaria. His fever rose rapidly, as it invariably does when this happens. He likewise could hardly stand on his feet. I attempted to carry his belongings again, in addition to my own, so he would not lose them. My companion began to waver, and finally to lean on me. With each step, the jungle fever sapped more of his waning energy. He was a large, husky fellow, a former champion swimmer, and sustaining his weight plus carrying 2 packs was little more than I could maneuver in my exhausted condition. But at last, I thought, I didn't have 5 degrees of fever as he had walking along in that torrid heat. I tried to explain to a guard that my companion was too sick to walk further. I said malaria and touched Whitman's forehead to indicate fever. The guard just scowled, looked at me fiercely, and very menacingly pointed his bayonet at me in answer. We were both on the verge of a blackout. Realizing something had to be done to ease the load, I reluctantly discharged our baggage containing all of our blankets and all of Harry's worldly belongings along the side of the dusty road. Finally, my companion just slithered from me as I was unable to support him any longer. The guard attempted to make him sit up with the prick of the bayonet, and I was fearful the treatment might result in something less playful. I mustered all my remaining strength with the help of another man, himself in difficulties. We lifted Whitman up. In a semi-conscious state, we half dragged him for about a block. The guard pointed forward with his gun and said, "How so?"
Lies!
When he said, "How so?" we thought he meant a small nipa hut a short distance away in a rice paddy, and assumed it to be perhaps a first aid station. I was wrong in my conclusions, for as we broke from the column, we started down the little path. It was only too evident we did the wrong thing. The Jap guard came screaming at us. He was very wrathful as he approached. With bayonet fixed to his rifle, he made a lunge at us. We both felt the impact of cold steel. As I felt its meaning prick, I half pulled, half dragged my companion and myself back into the column again, being banged intermittently with the butt of the guard's weapon. By the will of God, we traversed another 200 yards, but each new step became a distinct and contemplative torture for us. Then at the foot of a hill, our strength came to an end. I arose and tried to pull Whitman up. It was no use. Whitman had slipped into merciful unconsciousness. At last the unfeeling guard let him lie in the deep grass bordering the road and planted a tall spiked bamboo stick to which was attached a piece of white muslin, indicating that a recumbent form lay at its base. I felt pretty rotten about leaving Harry there, but I knew a truck would pick him up eventually. Later that day, when a truck brought him to Camp Number 3, Whitman told me that after he came to his senses, he looked up and saw a Jap guard nearby who was attracted to him when he began to stir. Harry said he looked up with a pleasant look and a slight smile on his face. He was naturally a good-natured individual. The guard mistook this as an indication that he had been playing a possum, and apparently thought a person who is sick is certainly not able to smile about it. Whitman told me that the Jap was just about to slash him with that bayonet he held poised above him. Sensing a crisis, Whitman tapped his head, whereupon the guard realized he was a sick man. It was a tense moment. That well-intentioned smile was almost his nemesis. He was a splendid fellow, and I enjoyed my associations with him through the months at Camp Number 3 and on the Nichols Airfield detail. His hobby was small boat building, and I sincerely hope he may return safely and enjoy the fulfillment of his plans, of which he spoke to me often.
That last line is what started my research into Whitman's life. Actually started my research into all the Filipino and American servicemen and women who I've highlighted so far and will continue to highlight going forward. Whitman remained in the Cabanatuan camps for nearly 2.5 years. Cabanatuan was a rough camp with scarce food and medical attention, compounded by disease, hard labor, and beatings. At some point, Whitman spent time with my grandfather at the, quote, inhuman hellhole, close quote, work camp of Nichols Field. The Japanese forced the sick and starving POWs to hand dig a new airstrip. They dug the bottom of a hill until it collapsed, sometimes burying POWs alive. And here's the rest of Whitman's story, which Psalm never knew. On December 13, 1944, Ensign Harry Whitman entered the rear hold of the Japanese ship Oroku Maru in Manila. The Japanese were transferring American prisoners to camps in Japan. More than 1,600 POWs were jammed into the ship's 3 holds as it sailed around the Bataan Peninsula. Unfortunately, the ship wasn't marked, so U.S. planes didn't know what cargo the ship contained when they attacked the ship. 1,300 POWs escaped the sinking ship and swam to shore at the Olongapo Navy base. Now, some official sources say that Whitman was one of the 300 who died during that attack, the sinking and/or swimming to shore. And since Whitman was, according to my great-grandfather, a champion swimmer, my guess is that he would have been killed before the POWs escaped the ship. However, other official sources give a different death date for Whitman. If those sources are correct, then once on shore, Whitman spent several days on the base's tennis courts with the other survivors, unprotected from the scorching Philippine sun. Again, the men had inadequate food and water. Eventually, he was trained 100 miles north to Lingayen Gulf. Here, Harry Whitman would have entered either the Enora Maru or the Brazil Maru, both of which sailed from the Philippines on December 27, 1944. These 2 hell ships were filled with sick, starving, dehydrated POWs. After 2.5 years of incarceration, many weighed under 90 pounds, and that would have been a drop of some 100 pounds for the 5'9" Whitman. One colonel described the conditions.
Many men lost their minds and crawled about in the absolute darkness armed with knives, attempting to kill people in order to drink their blood, or armed with canteens filled with urine and swinging them in the dark. The hold was so crowded and everyone so interlocked with one another that the only movement possible was over the heads and bodies of others.
Both ships reached Takao Formosa, which is in present-day Taiwan, on New Year's Day 1945, where all the POWs were transferred to the Enora Maru. That ship was, of course, unmarked, and on January 9, 1945, American planes bombed it as it was anchored in Takao Harbor. 350 POWs died in the attack. Among them, those other official sources say, was Ensign Harry G. Whitman. He was just 29 years old. The Cabanatuan POW camp would be liberated only 21 days later. Alma Salm was among those rescued from that camp, and he never knew what happened to his friend Harry. Harry Whitman's remains were never found. He was declared missing in action and non-recoverable. As I said earlier, official documents give different accounts of when Whitman perished. For example, one undated military document for Whitman and entitled, quote, Non-Recoverable Remains, Re-examination of Records, close quote, states,
Oriyoko Maru. Remains recovered at Takao Formosa. Impossible to segregate satisfactorily.
Now, this statement is confusing because the Oriyoko Maru sank in the Philippines and not in Takao Formosa. So it epitomizes the confusion about when and where Whitman did perish. If Whitman did indeed die in the ship bombing at Takao, then his remains would have likely been added to a mass grave near that port. After the war, that grave was uninterred and the mixed remains were recovered. That's why the report earlier said it was impossible to segregate the remains. Some 350 men could have been buried in that grave. Those mixed remains were reinterred at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which is commonly called Punch Bowl. But here again, I'm a little confused because the parents of other men who were known to have been interred in the Takao grave received official letters from the military stating their sons' remains were at Punch Bowl, and I haven't found such a letter in Whitman's official death file. So did Whitman die when the Oriyoko Maru was attacked and sunk, or in Takao when the Enora Maru was bombed? My guess is that the military didn't get any good answers from Oriyoko Maru survivors after the war, so that piece of information is unfortunately lost to history, which makes it all the more important to tell Whitman's story. Today, Ensign Harry Gill Whitman's name appears on the tablets of the missing at Manila American Cemetery, and his family erected a cenotaph at the Greenwood Cemetery in Petoskey, Michigan. Ensign Whitman received a Bronze Star and Purple Heart posthumously. His only brother was a member of the Army Air Corps in Africa during World War II. He returned home, married, and eventually had a son, who he named Harry Gill Whitman. When Ensign Whitman and the other POWs arrived at Cabanatuan, one of the first things they were told by their captors was that escape was futile and would be severely punished. However, after just a few days in the camp, a small group of young men did just that. So be sure to hit the follow button because there will be more on that in the next POW story. This is Left Behind. Thanks for listening. You can find pictures, maps, and sources about Harry Whitman's story on the Left Behind Facebook page and website, and on Instagram at Left Behind Podcast. The links are all in the show description. Left Behind is researched, written, and produced by me, Anastasia Harmon. Voiceovers by Paul Sutherland and Tyler Harmon. Special thanks to John Aiken for providing Harry Whitman's individual deceased personnel file, which helped me attempt to figure out when Harry Whitman died. Dramatizations are based on historical research, although some creative liberty is taken with dialogue and setting. And remember to subscribe to Left Behind because you won't want to miss the first escape from Cabanatuan.